Many Canadians are feeling anxious about the drastically changing world.
It did not begin with a royal proclamation or an official press release. There was no gilded crest, no ceremonial delivery through the palace gates. It began, instead, with something almost insultingly ordinary, a plain, beige envelope that could have come from anywhere, bearing no royal seal, not return address, and no hint of warning about the storm it carried inside. The envelope arrived quietly, slid across the cluttered desk of a well-known investigative reporter in London on a rainy afternoon. The kind of day when the city feels as though it is holding its breath. Its arrival was so unremarkable that, for a moment, it seemed destined to be overlooked. Yet the moment the flap was pried open, the air in the room changed. Inside lay a scattering of items that seemed, at first glance, unrelated. A handful of grainy photographs, whose blurred edges suggested they had been taken in haste. A single torn page, from what appeared to be an internal security log, and a letter written in a hurried, unverhand. The ink had bled in places, as if the pen had been pressed too hard against the paper. The words carved out of urgency rather than composed with care. The sentences did not read like mere accusations. They carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and kept it too long. She locked her there in the dark. I couldn't help her. But the king knows. The letter read, the final words underlined twice. The pressure of the pen cutting faint grooves into the paper. The signature had been blacked out. But in one corner the sender had left a small, defiant note of identification. Someone who had once served in Clarence House. For anyone else? It might have been just another tip in a city full of whispers. But to those who understood the coded language of palace life, the implications were volcanic. Clarence House, the historic residence that had seen centuries of royal comings and goings, was not a place where such claims could exist without consequence. Yet here it was, a package that seemed to speak from within the very walls of the monarchy, carrying evidence of something unthinkable. What struck the reporter most was not just the content, but the tone of the letter. It did not seek to persuade. It did not embellish. It simply stated what had happened, with the certainty of someone who no longer cared if they were believed. Only that the truth, finally, would no longer be theirs alone to bear. From that moment, the silence surrounding one of the most peculiar and troubling absences in recent royal history began to splinter. The envelope had cracked open a fault line beneath the monarchy's polished surface. And though the outside world had not yet felt the tremor, those closest to the crown would soon realize that what had been buried in the shadows of the palace was about to see the light. In the early weeks of spring, when London's parks were just beginning to shed their winter grey, an absence began to take shape in the public eye, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Princess Catherine, whose schedule was as meticulously curated as the gilded frames that lined the palace corridors, vanished from public view for more than 10 days. To the casual observer, there was nothing unusual about a royal taking private time. The institution thrived on the illusion of normal absences, but this felt different. And those who knew how to read the unspoken rhythms of the palace could sense it. There were no carefully staged photographs to fill the void. No smiling images of Catherine at charity events. No benign update from official channels designed to reassure the public. Even the most routine signposts of her presence were gone. Prince William, so often at her side, began appearing alone at engagements. The press, ever alert to subtle shifts, noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his smiles faltered in the seconds after a camera flash faded. When asked about his wife, his responses were brief, almost rehearsed, yet lacking the warmth of genuine ease. There was a pause before his words, a pause that seemed to stretch longer with each public appearance. Behind the palace walls, whispers began to thread their way through corridors, not yet emptied of staff for the night. Some said a junior member of the household had seen new locks being fitted to a cellar door in the West Wing, an area of Clarence House already known for its quiet, unsettling seclusion. Others spoke of hearing muffled weeping at night, sounds that could be explained away as the groan of old pipes, yet persisted in a way that made those explanations feel thin. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla seemed to bloom in Catherine's absence, her public schedule filled with engagements, her laughter a little louder, her presence a little more commanding than before. Photographers captured her stepping from cars in tailored coats, her gaze fixed directly ahead, as if there were no questions worth anticipating. To the outside world, it might have looked like nothing more than a confident queen consort performing her duties. But inside the palace, those who served close enough to see the glances exchanged in the hallways knew that something was shifting. A quiet unease had begun to settle in the air, an unease that had no official name, yet could be felt in the way conversations cut short when certain footsteps approached. It was not until later that the pattern would emerge: the absence of photographs, the strategic silence from official channels, the strangely buoyant mood of one royal figure against the strained demeanor of another. At the time, it was simply a riddle, without enough pieces to solve. But for those who lived in the shadow of the crown, the knowledge that something was deeply amiss had already taken root, and like all things within the monarchy, it would be revealed not with an explosion, but with the slow, deliberate cracking of the facade. It was meant to be an evening of unity, the kind of quiet family dinner the palace staged behind closed doors whenever the pressure of public life threatened to fray its carefully woven threads. The long dining table in Clarence House had been dressed with understated elegance: white linen, polished silver, crystal glasses catching the soft gleam of chandelier light. Princess Catherine arrived in a soft blue gown that moved like water when she walked, her hair drawn back in a way that made her seem almost fragile in the candlelight. Those present would later recall her smile, gentle but distant, a smile that hovered without ever fully reaching her eyes. Across the table, Queen Camilla commanded the conversation, her voice carried easily over the quiet murmur of the meal, her laughter ringing louder than anyone else's, just enough to make the room tilt toward her. She made jokes that landed with the thud of something sharper underneath, remarks dressed as compliments but weighted with meaning, and though she engaged the group, her gaze returned, again and again, to Catherine, measuring her, assessing her, the way one might look at a rival rather than a daughter-in-law. The courses passed swiftly, and yet there was a heaviness in the air, an undercurrent that seemed to pull the evening toward some unseen conclusion. Then, without explanation, the dinner ended earlier than expected, at around 10 o'clock. Staff who would normally remain on duty until the early hours were dismissed for the night. An unusual breach of protocol in a household where routine was as fixed as stone. Catherine's personal protection officers were quietly thanked and relieved of duty, a decision reportedly approved by someone far up the chain of command. One officer would later admit to feeling uneasy about it. Though he followed the order as given, Catherine herself appeared puzzled when told her security detail would no longer be needed. But she nodded with the grace of someone raised to accept palace decisions without question. That was the last time he saw her for 4 days. In the hours that followed, Clarence House seemed to fall into an unnatural stillness. Yet in one dim corridor of the West Wing, a junior cleaner noticed movement where there should have been none. She saw Queen Camilla descending the narrow staircase that led to the lower levels, a heavy ring of keys in her hand. The cleaner could not say what compelled her to linger in the shadows, only that she heard, moments later, a sound that seemed to come from behind one of the locked cellar doors. It was not the rattle of pipes, nor the scurrying of rodents. It was deliberate, soft, rhythmic, like someone tapping or knocking in a pattern that meant to be understood. She thought, fleetingly, of calling out, but the weight of palace silence pressed against her. By morning, she had been told to keep to her duties and stop asking questions. What took place in those intervening hours was never spoken of aloud within the family. But for those in service that night, it became the point on the calendar when the palace itself seemed to shift, when a place meant to symbolize duty, stability, and tradition took on, if only for a handful of days, the qualities of a prison. Beneath the polished floors and ceremonial staircases of Clarence House lies a warren of service corridors few outsiders have ever seen. It is here, past a heavy wooden door that blends into the panelled walls, that the West Wing cellar begins a part of the residence long shrouded in speculation. Officially, it has been listed for years as an old wine cellar, a relic of another century's domestic life. But documents later uncovered by a small historical society revealed a detail that raised questions. The cellar had been quietly renovated within the past decade, not by the palace's own restoration teams, but by private contractors whose names never appeared on official records. No public photographs were ever released, and the work was filed under a vague heading restricted for royal privacy. Among those who served in Clarence House, however, it was known by another name, the cold room. Those who had reason to pass nearby spoke of the way the temperature seemed to drop the moment you stepped into that corridor, of the damp air that clung to the skin. The stone walls, older than the modern city outside, seemed to swallow sound. Even before the rumors, there was an unease about the place. One former night guard, now retired, described what he believed took place there during the days of Catherine's disappearance. He claimed to have seen Queen Camilla herself turn the key in the brass lock one night, her gloved hand steady, her expression unreadable. She offered no explanation, only a short, cold instruction to avoid the west side for the next few days. He obeyed palace protocol, left no room for defiance, but he could not shake what he heard in the hours that followed. It was not crying, not even raised voices, but a low, measured call, repeated at intervals, as if the person inside had decided that panic would be useless, and only patience might offer a chance of being heard. The guard would later describe the room in unsettling detail. It was small, with no windows, the air heavy and cool as though the stones themselves exhaled frost. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, its filament so old it flickered with each fluctuation of the current. Against one wall stood a narrow cot, no more than a strip of mattress covered in thin sheets, and beside it, a wooden chair, placed as though someone had been stationed there to watch. The only ventilation was a small grate near the floor, too low to offer a view, too small to serve as an escape. There was no way to see in, and no way to see out. If Catherine had indeed been kept there for 3 nights, as the anonymous letter claimed, it would have been an unbearable confinement, not merely because of the physical discomfort, but because of what it represented. For a woman accustomed to the open spaces of royal gardens, the light-filled rooms of public engagements, and the quiet security of her own quarters, the cold room would have been a calculated stripping away of dignity. After her return, there were whispers of another round of renovations in the West Wing, work that some believed was intended to erase traces of what had happened. But for those who had walked past that heavy door during the missing days, the memory remained. They would remember the faint sounds, the stillness, and the knowledge that behind the veneer of royal stability, something profoundly cruel had unfolded in the shadows. For those who had served the royal household long enough to witness the quiet wars waged behind its walls, the events of that spring were not entirely without precedent. Camilla's temperament had always been measured in public, her composure reinforced by decades of navigating scrutiny. Yet those close enough to her private world had seen moments fleeting but unmistakable, when her smile did not reach her eyes, when her words carried the faint, metallic edge of something sharper. It was not the titles or the ceremonial duties that most unsettled her, but the way the public gaze seemed to shift, again and again, toward Catherine. From the moment Catherine married into the family, comparisons to Diana had been inevitable. The media framed her as the natural heir to Diana's legacy, graceful without calculation, poised without stiffness. capable of speaking to a stranger with the same warmth she showed to dignitaries. Camilla, who had fought for decades to reframe her own image after the very public scandal of Charles and Diana's marriage, found herself once again standing in a shadow she could not escape. It was not simply that Catherine was beloved, it was that she seemed to embody the qualities that the late princess had carried so effortlessly, qualities that Camilla had never been able to claim without question. In the months before Catherine's disappearance, the gap between them had widened in subtle ways. At public events, cheers for Catherine swelled louder and lingered longer. Foreign dignitaries leaned in when she spoke, holding her gaze in a way that suggested genuine connection. Even Charles, who had built his life with Camilla through storms of controversy, seemed, at moments, quietly moved by the ease with which Catherine navigated the treacherous dance between tradition and approachability. William and Catherine's marriage, visibly anchored in affection, only deepened the contrast. For a woman who had spent years defending her place in the institution, these moments were not small. They were reminders of how fragile influence can be. The tipping point, according to one former palace advisor, came in the aftermath of a private meeting with several Commonwealth ambassadors. Catherine had delivered a brief but heartfelt speech on unity and cultural respect, and the reception had been nothing short of glowing. Ambassadors later praised her directly to Charles, calling her the future face of the monarchy, a bridge between tradition and modernity. Camilla had not been present at the meeting, but she heard the reports in full. Every compliment, every remark about Catherine's potential was repeated to her until the air itself seemed heavy with it. It was in the retelling that something shifted. Those who knew Camilla well described it not as an explosion of temper, but as a hardening, a quiet resolve forged in humiliation. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. Instead, she withdrew into herself with the stillness of a storm gathering out of sight. In her mind, the threat was no longer abstract. It had a face, a voice, and a growing claim on the affections of the king and his subjects. The night of the family dinner followed not long after, and while the exact moment of decision would remain locked inside Camilla's own mind, those who pieced together the fragments believe it was that week after the praise. After the private comparisons that she crossed a threshold, what happened in the days that followed was not merely the expression of anger, it was, to those who have studied the monarchy's long history of rivalries, the oldest form of royal warfare to remove a threat not through public denouncement, but through isolation, silence, and erasure. In the days immediately following Catherine's disappearance, King Charles had no reason, at least none that he allowed himself to admit, to doubt the explanations offered to him. His schedule had taken him to Scotland for a series of official meetings, and the narrative was presented with such calm assurance that it seemed almost unworthy of suspicion. Catherine, he was told, had been advised to take time away from the public eye, to rest and regain her strength after what was framed as a period of exhaustion. Camilla herself spoke gently when the matter arose, assuring him that all was well, that she had personally ensured Catherine was given the privacy she needed. To a man accustomed to her counsel and reliant on her steadiness, there was nothing in her tone to suggest a reason for alarm. But when Charles returned to Clarence House, the story began to fracture. The first moment he saw Catherine again was in a private drawing room. She stood by the tall window, the light from outside outlining her in pale relief against the shadows. When she turned to him, there was no greeting, no small smile of recognition, only a silent, almost studied look that seemed to measure him as though she were unsure which side of the wall he stood on. Without a word, she stepped past him and left the room, her movements measured, her eyes fixed on something he could not see. It was not anger that unsettled him most, but the absence of anything at all. That night, in the quiet of his study, the truth arrived without ceremony. A folded letter, left on his desk in his absence, bore no name, only his title in a precise, almost formal hand. Inside, the writing was uneven. The ink smudged in places where the pen had pressed too hard or lingered too long. The account was brief, but devastating: the dismissal of Catherine's security detail, the unauthorized use of the West Wing cellar, the sounds heard behind its locked door. The final line, underlined once, reads simply, "You trusted her, but she caged Catherine." The words struck with a force that left him motionless. For a long while, he sat in the stillness, the letter open on his desk, before the weight of it buckled him. The valet who entered later with tea found the king on the floor, the paper clutched to his chest, his shoulders heaving with quiet, uncontrollable sobs. It was not only grief for Catherine's ordeal that gripped him, but the shattering realization that the betrayal had come from the one person he had defended without reservation. The woman for whom he had fought battles, both public and private. He had built the later years of his life on the belief that she was his ally, his anchor in the storms of monarchy. Now that anchor felt like a stone dragging him under. In the days that followed, Charles withdrew in ways the public had never seen. He cancelled appearances without explanation, skipped the morning chapel service for the first time in decades, and spent long hours alone in his private quarters. The machinery of the monarchy continued to move around him, papers signed, briefings delivered, but he seemed detached, his attention wandering to places no one else could follow. Those who tried to speak to him about it were met with silence, or with a nod that carried no commitment to conversation. What had been done was irreversible, and in the knowledge of it, Charles bore not only the shame of inaction, but the unbearable truth that he had been a bystander to a crime within his own house. When the palace finally allowed Princess Catherine to re-emerge, it was done with the precision of a stage play. There was no press conference, no interview, no opportunity for questions that might veer into dangerous territory. Instead, a short, antiseptic statement was issued, thanking the public for their support and explaining that the Princess of Wales had taken time to rest. On paper, it was enough to close the matter. In reality, it was a carefully drawn curtain, meant to hide far more than it revealed. Her first public appearance came just 3 days later at a children's charity event. Photographers captured her arrival, smiling politely, a bouquet of flowers in hand. To the casual eye, she was the same Catherine, elegant, composed, every movement aligned with the quiet grace that had made her so beloved. But those who looked closely, those who knew her beyond the photographs, I saw a difference that could not be smoothed away by wardrobe and lighting. She was thinner, her complexion paler, her posture a fraction more guarded. Her eyes, once quick to meet the gaze of those around her, now seemed to flit past faces, landing only briefly before moving on. Several aides present that day would later speak, in hushed tones, of the way she reacted to certain things, a sudden noise in the hallway that made her flinch almost imperceptibly, the way she avoided any corridor without windows, the slight hesitation before stepping into a room where someone stood too close behind her. These were not the mannerisms of a woman simply returning from exhaustion. They were the traces of someone who had been made to feel unsafe in a place that was meant to be her sanctuary. At home, changes in her habits became quickly apparent to the staff. She began keeping her personal aides within sight at all times, even in informal settings. Her bedroom door, once left open to the trusted quiet of the royal residence, that was now locked at night, a precaution no one could remember her taking before. Most telling of all was her avoidance of the West Wing altogether. Without explanation, her daily routine was rearranged, so that she would never have reason to pass through those halls. It was as if she had drawn an invisible line across the floor plan of Clarence House, a line she would not cross. Her relationship with Camilla shifted into a kind of formal avoidance. Gone were the orchestrated moments of warmth for the cameras, the shared laugh at an engagement, the public compliment. When they appeared together, It was only out of necessity. Their interactions reduced to the bare minimum of civility. Camilla carried on as though nothing had changed. Her public presence undiminished. Her speeches on unity and tradition delivered with practiced ease, but between them hung a silence that the palace's choreographers could not erase. William, by contrast, became visibly more protective. He was seen holding Catherine's hand more often, leaning toward her during engagements, watching her closely in the moments between camera shutters. Insiders say he confronted his father in private, pressing for answers, but was met with sorrow and a reluctance to speak. Charles, it seemed, was not ready to put the truth into words. Not yet, and so Catherine moved forward, not by telling her story, but by reclaiming her presence in the only way she could, through the work itself. She smiled for children, offered comfort to the grieving, stood alongside those who needed her, and in doing so, began to rebuild her strength in plain sight. Her silence was not an absence of courage. It was its own form of defiance. In refusing to voice what had happened, she denied it the oxygen it would need to define her. Instead, she carried it quietly, like a wound healing beneath layers no one else could see. In the vast, interlocking machinery of the royal household, there are figures who move so quietly, so unobtrusively, that their presence becomes almost invisible. The butler was one of them, a man who had served through decades of ceremony and scandal, who had polished silver for state banquets and poured tea in private moments of grief. He had been there for Diana, had watched the young princes grow into men, and later had witnessed the gradual rise of Catherine as a beloved figure both inside and outside the palace walls. Discretion was his craft, loyalty his currency, and in all his years of service, he had never been known to step out of the shadows. But after Catherine's return from her unexplained absence, he found himself unsettled in a way that decades of palace life had never managed before. It was not the change in her appearance that haunted him, nor even the subtle shifts in her habits. It was her silence. He recognized it instantly, the way a man recognizes a scar on a face he has seen before. It was the same silence Diana had carried in her final years, a silence that spoke not of shyness or discretion, but of something endured and never forgotten. The butler had been on duty the night Catherine vanished. His station that evening placed him within the orbit of the West Wing, where few were permitted after hours. He saw Camilla pass him just after midnight, walking alone, an odd breach of protocol in a household where senior royals were rarely without protection. She carried a heavy ring of keys in her hand and did not acknowledge him as she descended toward the lower levels. At the time, he assumed she was retrieving something from storage or the wine cellar. But there was something in her pace steady, deliberate, that lodged in his mind. In the days that followed, he noticed details that did not fit the official narrative. A breakfast tray matching Catherine's exact morning preference: eggs, soft, tea without sugar. Toast with no butter was carried not to her quarters, but down toward the cellar, at Camilla's request. The kitchen staff, bound by their own codes of obedience, did not question it. Passing the cellar door that morning, the butler paused. He could hear movement inside, not frantic, not loud, but the measured rhythm of someone pacing in a confined space. It was the kind of sound that could be ignored if one wished to protect their position. And that is precisely what he did at the time. The palace was not a place that forgave curiosity. Months later, after his quiet retirement, the weight of what he had seen and heard no longer allowed him the comfort of silence. The meeting with the journalist was arranged in secrecy, far from London, in a small corner table of a cafe where the windows steamed from the cold outside. He arrived early, wearing a coat with the collar turned up and a cap pulled low over his brow. He did not speak names outright, but he described the nights, the keys, the breakfast tray, the pacing footsteps. When the journalist asked if he was certain about who had locked the door, The butler's eyes held for a long moment before he answered. "I saw her go down there," he said quietly. "And I saw who turned the key behind her. It was the missing piece." The testimony that no one inside the palace wanted spoken aloud, and though he offered it without flourish, without any sense of vengeance, his words would become the thread that, once pulled, threatened to unravel the entire tapestry of silence the monarchy had so carefully woven. The butler's quiet testimony might have been enough to stir unease. But what surfaced next would shatter the last defences of secrecy within Clarence House. It came not from an outsider, nor from a staff member defying orders, but from the king himself, though he had never intended it to leave his private possession. It was a letter, handwritten in the days after Catherine's return, folded neatly and locked inside a drawer in his personal study. It had been meant for her eyes alone, a gesture of contrition from a man who understood that apology was the weakest of offerings, yet still felt compelled to make it. The handwriting was unmistakable, a blend of the formal elegance drilled into him in youth, and the uneven strokes of a man writing through grief. The opening lines carried no preamble, no ceremonial tone, only a raw admission. "I failed you. I failed to see what was happening in my own house." He wrote of the trust he had placed, without hesitation, in the one person he had defended for most of his life. He described how, when he first saw Catherine after her disappearance, he felt as though he was looking at someone deciding whether he was a protector or part of the betrayal. And in that moment, he knew something unforgivable had been done. The letter moved between confession and self-reproach, painting a portrait of a man wrestling with the knowledge that the signs had been there all along. He recalled moments when Camilla had dismissed Catherine's work with a quiet, cutting remark, when she had spoken of Diana, not with sadness, but with a warning, "Do not let another Diana rise here." He admitted that he had brushed these moments aside, calling them frustrations born of public pressure, telling himself she only needed reassurance. Now, with the truth laid before him in the form of key logs, witness accounts, and unexplained dismissals of security, he saw those moments for what they had been, advance warnings he had chosen to ignore. In the most haunting section, Charles described the night the truth arrived on his desk. A member of the household, unable to carry the weight any longer, had left an envelope containing the evidence logs showing access to the West Wing cellar. Unexplained surveillance blind spots. Messages from Catherine's team that had never been answered. He wrote of falling to the floor, of pressing the letter to his chest, of sobbing into the carpet as the enormity of what had happened settled over him. "The crown is meant to protect," he wrote, "but under my watch, it became a cage." He ended with a promise, one that carried no guarantee of redemption, yet seemed the only thing he could offer. "I will never let it happen again." The words were underlined once, as if to anchor them to the page, as if by the sheer force of his handwriting he could make them unbreakable. How the letter left his study remains unclear. Some say it was copied by a sympathetic aide who believed the public had a right to know. Others believe Catherine herself allowed its contents to slip into trusted hands. Whatever the path, once it surfaced, the letter transformed the story from rumour into reckoning. It was no longer about whispers in palace corridors. It was about a king brought to his knees, not by enemies of the crown, but by the consequences of his own blind trust. Once the letter emerged, the palace's decades-old mastery of narrative control began to unravel. This was not a tabloid rumour to be brushed aside with a crisp denial, nor a political misstep to be softened with polished language. It was the king's own hand, his own words, laid bare for the world, a private confession that now lived in the public domain. The impact was immediate. Journalists no longer asked if something had happened to Catherine during her absence. The only questions now were how it had been allowed to happen and who would bear the consequences. Inside the palace, a quiet fracture appeared. Senior aides, who had once moved in lockstep, began to drift into discrete factions. Some kept their distance from Camilla, avoiding her in corridors where they once lingered for conversation. Her authority, once sharpened by a single raised eyebrow or an unspoken order, no longer held the same weight. Public engagements became fewer, her once effortless charm replaced by a thin, brittle civility. Those who had watched her for years recognized the shift, not the presence of open hostility, but the absence of deference. She was still the queen consort, but the air around her had changed. Catherine, meanwhile, remained steadfastly silent. She granted no interviews, offered no public reflections on her absence, and never so much as hinted at the events that had transpired. Instead, she returned to her duties with an almost disarming grace. She visited children in hospitals, sat in small rooms with survivors of domestic violence, and stood beside families in moments of raw grief. Her voice was gentle, her presence steady. The public, once content to admire her elegance, now regarded her with something deeper respect, rooted in the belief that she had endured something that might have broken another, and yet chose to rise without vengeance. For King Charles, the fallout was more complex. Officially, he reduced his schedule to focus on his health and periods of reflection. But within the palace, the shift was more visible. He and Camilla no longer travelled together for engagements. At Balmoral, they maintained separate quarters. Even during national ceremonies, they appeared apart, each surrounded by their own aides. The unity they had once projected, a unity he had defended for decades, was thinning under the weight of what remained unsaid. In private, discussions of succession began to circulate, quiet but persistent. Some advisors believed Charles would never abdicate outright, but might gradually transfer more duties to William, allowing the public to see a steady, controlled transition. Others feared that the mounting scrutiny could force a more abrupt change. For the first time in years, the question was not simply who wore the crown, but whether the crown itself could survive the revelation of what had happened within its own walls. Beyond the palace gates, the monarchy's image was shifting in the eyes of the public. Loyalty was no longer tied solely to the institution, but to the individuals within it, and increasingly, that loyalty was gravitating toward Catherine. She had not spoken a single word of accusation, yet her silence had told the whole story. In her composure, people saw dignity. In her restraint, they saw strength. The monarchy, scarred and exposed, moved forward because she allowed it to, but not without the shadow of what had been done to her. And so the story that began with an unmarked envelope ended with a truth. The palace could no longer bury that behind the gold-stitched curtains and the glittering tiaras. There are wounds that even centuries of tradition cannot conceal. Catherine carried hers quietly. The king carried his in guilt. And the queen consort carried hers in the eyes of those who now looked at her differently. The crown still shone in the light. But for those who had witnessed the events of that spring, its gleam would forever be edged with the memory of the cold, locked room beneath Clarence House.